Hello friends, Luke here, and today we're going to talk about the two paths. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this concept, but it's essentially this idea that spiritually you can go one of two ways. It's particularly something that I find in Eastern philosophy. So I'll give you some ideas about this, and this is going to be a little bit vague, but I'll just put it in perspective. So one teacher who's kind of a little bit odd is Osho, and he talked about this kind of point blank, but it's also talked about in the Yoga Sutras. Depending on the translation, the ideas of tapas, swadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana at the beginning of chapter 2 are listed as the three elements of practice. But in the first chapter, it actually alludes to that you could try to pursue tivrasanam veganam asana. Through more intense practice, you can attain yogic goals faster, or at varying speeds, I should say. And then Ishvara Pranidhana is presented as an alternate, as sort of receptive path, if you will, and a path of surrender. So I'm going to pause that, and I'm just going to talk about some other traditions that to me offer the two sides of this coin, where you can pursue things in an assertive way or in a more receptive way. You can obviously mix the two, but think of meditation practices. Generally, in Buddhist lineages that I'm familiar with, there's two types of meditation. One is like training the mind, and the other one is calm abiding. So if you look at, for example, what's typically called Tibetan Buddhism, a lot of times they're training the mind, using skills and exercises to understand and very intricate sort of like structures and trainings in place to develop a person's consciousness. And then in Zen, so I'll never forget going to the San Francisco Zen Center, and after spending so much time around Buddhism and Buddhist literature and learning about the Four Noble Truths and the truths of suffering, the chant that we did said that there was no suffering, there was no path, and it was the opposite in a way. And that's because most Zen practitioners believe in what's called the doctrine of no mind. So you wouldn't acknowledge mind or anything that comes from mind because there's no such thing as mind. So in this regard, Zen would be this more receptive approach, if you will, a calm abiding approach of waiting or something like that. I was around some Zen practitioners. Actually, yesterday I did this online retreat with San Francisco Zen Center, and there was a woman there, and she just, my feeling about her was that she was brilliant. She said something like, only Zazen can do Zazen. And it's almost as if to say that when you're there, you almost have to just let the practice be what it is. And that in and of itself is Zen, or something to that effect. And so I think that this is, it's also prevalent, I think, I don't know if this is exactly the same thing, but there's never mind. There's a lot of parallels, I think, in different like schools of sort of Hindu thought and so forth, but I'm not as familiar, so I don't want to get into it. But let's say that you believed that your physical presence on earth was valid, that Prakriti, that your material body, you would interpret the Yoga Sutras when they say that Prakriti exists for the purpose of Purusha and not the other way around, to say that I'm going to utilize my physical body as a means of liberation from physical entrapments in samsara. It's a very big statement to make. So not everybody believes that. And but Hatha Yoga tends to believe something like that, or else you'd have to kind of invalidate their whole path because it's very physical. So asana practice or Hatha Yoga practice is not, all of yoga by any means, and it's definitely not all of Ashtanga, but it represents kind of a very sort of poignant example of utilizing Prakriti, sort of like as a science to develop liberation from this world and from the entrapments therein. What I've found in my life is that it almost takes more thinking and more concentration and more awareness to do it that way, because like when you find a new yoga posture or you're doing second series of Ashtanga and you do Kapotasana and you're elated, it's like, whoa, I feel so much different and better. Well, you have to recognize that at some point you're going to have to let that go too, because your body is going to naturally age. And so if Kapotasana is, in this essence, like a piece of Prakriti that's being utilized for purposes of liberation, it has to at least pull its own weight for whatever it is. As it said in the Yoga Sutras, that attachment to beauty exists even in the wise. And so we have to overcome the attachment that we develop to the material aspects of our spiritual practice, or they become actually more potent as obstacles than they do as forces of liberation for us. So back to the earlier pause. So in the Yoga Sutras, in the latter part of the first chapter around Sutra 120, it discusses how, and it depends on, I can chant in Sanskrit, but I don't actually speak Sanskrit. Well, I do, but I don't read it in Sanskrit. So if you read those sutras, it talks about how if you could surrender to Ishvara, that there's the alternate path right there. That you could go forward and push hard and try, or there is something else out there that if you just allowed it to take hold, you would have it. And it even suggests that that path is more instantaneous or spontaneous, because it's not limited by the progression of what appears to be very static steps that must be taken when you utilize Prakriti. Because Ishvara exists beyond space-time and beyond material, unifying with that or surrendering to that eliminates the need for the process of yoga to take a certain amount of time or several years. I find that very fascinating, and I find it to be true. And I encourage you to ask yourself what you think of that. Whether such things are possible to reach now, I say this, it doesn't mean that there's not a struggle or pain or karma or anything like that. It's to suggest that the path is somewhat clear. Om.